Hey guys, Youngblood with you for your Picking the Right Fighter video, this time reviewing ships over $150. Now, there's a lot that we've already covered, and frankly, there's a lot to go. So what we're going to do is start off by scrapping a few from the list right off the bat. And it may not necessarily be that some of these are bad options, but more that there's others in the same price range with similar capabilities that just get the nod instead. So instead, let's go ahead and take the Saber Comet and remove it off of the list, which is kind of funny because it's the one that I currently have and use and love. But that being said, you basically have the Saber frame, you've spent $15 more than stock, and while you do get a cool digital camo type of skin on it, the weapons that it comes with provide you with far less DPS than the Panthers that come on the stock variant. And like I said in the last video, the repeaters, whether that be ballistic or energy, just really outperform basically everything else at the moment. So when you get the slow firing Omni Skies and the distortion heavy Pyro Burst that the Comet come with, the performance just really doesn't line up to the base model. Now, similarly, when we look at the Super Hornet, there's a variant there called the Heartseeker, which again is $15 more over the base model. Now, it does come with a fun decal on it, and the shields are better by default, but it does have worse weaponry as it favors the laser cannons. It does come with 4 size 2 missiles instead of 8 size 1, but that's a swap you can make on the base Hornet as well. The last 3 that we're going to drop are frustrating because they're all alien, so it takes a little bit of diversity out of the list. But those are the Blade, the Scythe, and the Glaive. And it's important to remember that alien ships have a higher cost based on construed rarity. So when you look at the ROI on them, they're never really going to line up with what you get out of the human ships because they're more readily available. When it comes to the Blade, it's a fun little ship, and maybe has more of a role if you look at it as an interceptor, or maybe you want to use it in racing. But at the end of the day, it costs $375, and it has a terrible shield and a whole HP, and is underwhelming with its weaponry. The Scythe is $300. I think I said the Blade was $375. I meant $275. The Scythe is $300, but it's also not really sold anymore. So while it has some good performance, it's really just impossible to recommend to anybody since you can't buy it unless you go to the gray market. And finally, the Glaive, which is a ship I've been trying to like for a really long time, but it costs $350. It's much slower than you would expect it to. It carries a bizarre little amount of fuel on board, so you end up having to refuel all the time. Range is a problem. The damage output is moderate at best with the 2 size 5s that actually somehow underperform. It just is kind of a letdown of a ship. I have a lot of confidence that the Glaive is going to become a better ship than it is today, but as of right now, it just doesn't make sense for anybody to spend the money on it. So, up next, there's 2 ships that I'm going to talk about a bit, but I'm including them with some caveats. First off, when you start thinking about fighters, you're typically thinking of a ship that can be flown solo or without the support of another player or NPC on board. A good example of a ship that I want to talk about is the Hurricane, because it's a mean little ship and it's really kind of like a fighter. But it has a manned turret that cannot be controlled by the pilot. The ship does not perform without somebody in there. Now, when you look at the Hurricane, which costs $195, it's a smaller fighter that has a roughly Hornet type of flight model with an SCM speed at 198 meters per second and a top speed with afterburner about 1232, which puts it slightly faster than the Super Hornets in SCM speed and slower than most everything else. That afterburner speed, though, at 1232 is actually on the higher end of the ones that we're talking about on this list. So that gives you the ability to stay up to speed with enemy targets that you're chasing down, which helps things quite a bit. Agility is poor, which when you look at the ship doesn't really make a lot of sense. You got a slow turn rate and a slow roll rate. It's basically about the Hornet's performance as well. So if you're familiar with flying a Hornet, you're familiar with flying a Hurricane, basically. A big problem for the Hurricane comes in the durability of the ship. It has the lowest hull HP at 5,536 of all the ships that we're going to talk about today. Though it does have 2 all-stop shield generators on it, so it has a very strong HP for the shields, coming in at 10,800. That can be a problem, though, when you're trying to manage power if you're flying, taking damage, and trying to keep your shields up. When you have a turret on the back that's firing off 4 size 4 weapons. And that's right, I said 4 size 4 weapons on a fighter. And it's a good thing they're all ballistic weapons, otherwise the power plant would really struggle to keep up. Stock, the weapons on the turret are broadswords, which actually do a really nice job. And in addition, you have 2 size 4 mounts for the pilot, currently being occupied by 2 size 3 gimbal Predator shotguns, which actually have some of the highest damage output of all weapons in the game today. Additionally, you have 4 size 2 missiles. Now, the damage output on the Hurricane is the highest on this list by far, coming in at 3,459, basically doubling any other option that we would talk about today. And while that sounds appealing, you have to have a friend help you pull the trigger or aim for, just aiming the turret. Maybe we see automation at some point through, blades to give you an auto turret, or maybe you can hire an NPC fairly soon. But if your task at the moment is to fight, that's the real limitation. I love the Hurricane, and I have the Hurricane, but it's truly a glass cannon, and if you don't have a friend to help you out, you're a bit SOL. The other ship on the caveats list here is partially because you need a friend to help use the man turret it has, but also because it's just kind of in a different class altogether, and that's the Vanguard. I'm a big fan of the Vanguard line, or at least I want to be, but it has some real issues. There's 4 different Vanguards, and the prices are going to range from about $250 to $290. But their price and kind of performance is similar enough that I'm going to give you just some baseline estimated numbers here. First off, the speed is about 170 in SCM and about 1100 in Afterburner, so there's a lot of other ships that can just flat out outrun you, which is an odd tagline for a ship that's got like the Relentless Predator tagline to it. Maneuverability is the lowest of all the ships that we're addressing today, by far. It has, I guess I should say this, it shines in having a giant hit pool. It's got 25,000 for the hull and about 43,000 for the shields, which is far and above better than all of the other fighters. Where I start getting into issues, though, is when I start comparing this ship to other ships. This is a heavy fighter, but it's also really kind of a medium ship, with about everything else on this list really falling into more of the small ship category. It's just kind of impossible to talk about the Vanguard and the Saber in the same video because they're just such different animals. Regardless, though, it has good weaponry, which has a damage output of around 2,000 DPS, and the mounts on it are fairly impressive with a size 5 nose mount, 4 size 2s that are going to be really locked up into the nose, and then you have 2 more size 2s on the manned turret. The issue, though, with these weapons is, while they do vary a little bit by model, there's just so much damage potential that's locked up in the quad size 2s, and you cannot gimbal them. And there aren't really a lot of weapons options. You have 4 total that you can put into that slot. So you need to line your shots up well, which is challenging on a big, slow, and drifty ship, especially when the weaponry today is really more favoring a gimbaled gameplay model. I like the Vanguard, but it needs a serious quality of life review before I really can recommend it. And even then, it's a very different beast than the others that are on this list, so we're not really including it. So, with all of that in mind, let's actually jump into the ships that we're actually going to talk about in more detail, starting with the Aegis Favor. This is a $170 ship, which is sort of a stealth fighter, mostly being equipped with stealth class components, which for the most part perform well enough. The flight model on the Saber is great. It gives you an SCM speed of 206, 1235 when you get the boost applied. Agility is kind of about middle of the pack here on this list today. When you start talking about your pitch and yaw, however, the rolling is performing pretty well at the moment. The HP on the hull comes in at 9410, which is almost exactly middle of the pack. However, the shields being stealth really kind of going to perform poorly, only giving about 7020 HP total. Anytime you're looking at components right now, stealth doesn't really do a whole lot for you. Maybe at some point they'll tune that and make it a little bit more effective, but you're not really going to be picked up that much further away depending on your components at the moment. So if you do go for a Saber, I'd highly recommend you swapping out for military grade components because the ship just performs immensely better and you don't really lose a lot. Where things are good for the Saber is in the weaponry. Coming in with 4 Panthers, those are the laser repeaters, on 4 size 3 hardpoints. That also means that you could technically drop down to size 2s and run 4 size 2s that are gimbaled, which isn't too bad either. The stock DPS is 1668, which means that really only the Vanguard, the Hurricane, and the Scythe can top it. And when you consider that we've actually just dropped some of those off the list, this makes the Saber pretty appealing. And to add to that, you have 4 size 3 missiles, which are larger than basically everything else here carries by default. So you get more damage output there. Overall, the Saber is kind of the perfectly balanced ship because it flies well and it does a lot of damage. And with the right components, it's actually decently tanky. But I really just love the Saber. Now, the next one is actually the same price. And frankly, I had a slightly hard time including it in this conversation. And that's the GN Scout, also known as the Car-2All. The ship has a lot of highs and lows, with one strong point being the flight model, which makes it basically the fastest ship on the list, with an SCM speed of 224 and an afterburn speed at about 1323. And to add to that, you have the second highest turn values and better than middle roll values, and basically the agility is everything you would hope for. The ship accomplishes that because it doesn't really use standard maneuvering thrusters. It instead favors some articulated main thrusters, which mean that the strafe and the strafe ability and just the overall agility of the ship are kind of unreal. It just makes it really almost impossible to outmaneuver a GN Scout. It has a weird flight formation, though, that almost means that your ship is kind of vertical and wide facing the enemy, almost like an open hand. And while it's kind of cool and alien-like, it does mean that you're presenting your front to an enemy, and you're likely going to take damage if they can keep up with you because it's kind of a big frisbee-like surface they're shooting at. The good news, though, is that you actually have 10,690 in hull HP, which is just below the Hornet line, so you do have some HP there to kind of help you out. That being said, though, with only one shield generator and it being a stealth one by default, you have by far the lowest shield protection at 4,680. The other issue with this ship is the weapons. And while you do have Panthers on board, which are great weapons, you do only have 2 of them, and they are fixed. So if you want a gimbal, you're down to 2 size 2s, and you carry no missiles. So this ship is really outgunned, so it's incredibly hard to deal enough damage that some of these other fighters can really do. But it is a ship that you can stick around with for a long time by avoiding damage. I personally don't really recommend this ship to anybody, but it is worth discussing since there are some real highs to it as far as the numbers are concerned. Next, we're going to talk about 2 of the Hornet variants, being the Wildfire at $175 and the Super Hornet priced at $180. It's important to know that while they are all variants of the same line, there is an actual hull difference between the F7C and the F7CM. The Wildfire is really being a souped-up kind of base Hornet, and the Super Hornet, it has the actual second seat. It's got the remote turret and a little bit more. Starting with the flight model, they are very similar, having about 192 meters per second for the Wildfire and 189 for the Super. You start talking about boost, the Wildfire comes in at 1229, which is just 1 meter per second faster than the Super Hornet. That also means that both are slower than a lot of ships on this list. The turn and roll values appear basically identical for these, so they both lack overall agility. That being said, you can counteract a lot of that when you start using reverse and strafe. You can generally keep targets in front of you well enough. I do find it interesting that the Wildfire actually has a higher hull HP at 11,042, actually making it highest on this list, with the Super Hornet coming in at 10,740. The difference isn't huge, so that seems to indicate that there's a little bit of heavier armor on the Wildfire, but I thought the Super Hornet was supposed to be beefed up too, so maybe that'll change over time, but it is worth pointing out at the moment. Also interesting is the Wildfire got web shields, which are kind of like baseline starter civilian shields. They only give you a total of 7,200 HP. Now, when you look at the Super Hornet, it has 2 all-stops, which mean that they actually have 10,800 shield pool, which is significantly better. Now, you could, of course, swap those out on the Wildfire, but that will cost you. I think all of that starts, I guess, kind of at this point, really just says that these are essentially close enough to kind of call it a wash. You know, you get a little bit more hull, you get a little bit more shield, you get a little bit blah, blah, blah. So I think where we need to start making a decision on these is when you start looking at the weaponry and the damage output. And at first look, the Super Hornet has a DPS of 1511, and the Wildfire comes in at 1345, which seems to make things simple, right? Well, it gets a little bit weird because the Wildfire comes with a flash fire mount on the top that's armed with a size 4 Revenant Gatling fixed, along with 2 size 3 fixed Tarantulas on the wings, which are good weapons. However, their overtime DPS is a little bit limited because of their slow firing ability. It does actually have another size 3 mount on the nose that allows for another size 3 weapon to be used, which drastically would increase the DPS output, which is not accounted for in the baseline number that I mentioned. The Super Hornet has 2 size 2 gimbaled Scorpion Gatlings, which are some of my favorites in the game right now, along with a ball turret that has 2 size 2 Badger laser repeaters that are pilot controlled, which is a nice feature, and what is also known as a canard turret hanging off the front nose that's going to give you 2 size 1 Bulldog repeaters, essentially meaning that you have 6 gimbaled weapons for the pilot, or 2 that can be leveraged by your backseat passenger if you decide to give them that ability. That being said, using 2 size 1s is never going to equal the performance of a size 3 in damage output. So while the Wildfire is limited by missing a nose gun in its stock DPS, the Super Hornet's also a little bit limited by seeing the canard turret there instead of having a size 3. If you actually just look at these as hard points, though, the ability for the Wildfire to equip a size 4 actually means that the higher end of the DPS spectrum favors the Wildfire. But it's all going to depend on the end result and how much flexibility CIG gives us in equipping these ships. For example, at the end of the day, can the Wildfire mount the ball turret and can the Super Hornet mount the flash fire? Maybe, and probably, but we're going to need to see. I think the best way to look at these two is like this. If you're the type that just prefers to leverage gimbals, then the Super Hornet is going to be the far superior option. But if you just want to be able to maximize your damage output, the Wildfire is a better stock option in its current situation. Based on the Super Hornet having the additional seat should you want it, and the current way that fights play out today, I would recommend the Super Hornet based on these two, and really only a $5 difference between them. I think the Super Hornet is just a better starting point at the moment. There are 2 more ships on the list for us to discuss. Both are alien, with only one of them being flight ready at the moment, which is the Banu Defender. This is a really interesting ship because it's got a medium to high speed flight model, 202 in SCM and 1200 in afterburn, and with slightly better than average maneuverability, though keep in mind some of these ships we're comparing them to are Hornets. For being a fairly large fighter, it's got a relatively low hull pool, which is going to come in at 7,500 total HP. But it really just doesn't seem to matter because this ship is the only one on the list that comes with a medium shield generator, which is typically used on ships like Cutlasses and Freelancers, which also means that the shield output is about 3 to 4 times that of what the others are included here because it's got a total shield HP of 38,460. That alone makes this ship really interesting. But in addition to that, the weaponry is kind of intriguing that it comes with as well. It is going to come with 4 size 2 gimbaled Tachyon Cannons. Now these guns are moderately heavy hitting, and though they have a slow rate of fire, they do have an almost instantaneously impacting projectile, almost like a faster version of a railgun. They perform a bit strangely at the moment, but you can see the direction that they're going. The DPS comes in pretty low actually at 629, but the current balance as mentioned is favoring continuous firing weapons like the repeaters and Gatlings, but these shouldn't be overlooked. You do also get 4 size 2 missiles, so while not particularly potent amount of firepower, it is something. This is one of the only ships on the list that's actually going to have the option to bring another player along with you because there are 2 cockpits on board the Banu Defender. They can also help you to help aim, fire, they can fly when you step away, and they also have the ability to control systems. It's also one of the only ships on the list that has a bed for you to be able to log out and spawn back in, and maybe not to be overlooked, but with the components available to you on the interior of the ship, you do also have the ability to repair them without having to get into a spacesuit and float around and find everything. You can do it while the other person's flying, which is really handy. I don't know if this ship's actually worth $220, but I do really like it, and if you prefer different stylings and combat methods, it's a pretty legit option to consider. And the last one that we're going to talk about is the new kind of beefed up GN ship, the GN Santaki I. And while you may look at this as a souped up version of the Scout, there is frankly a lot that we don't know yet. What we do know is that it has articulated engines like the Kar-2 so I'm expecting a highly controllable ship. On the stats page, it's got an SCM speed that's expected to come in at about 265 meters per second, which would be by far the fastest on this list. And much like the Defender, it also comes with a medium shield generator, meaning very strong output and protection. It may have more hull HP than the Scout, But I think we have to assume that the HP of the hull is going to be lower than many human ships, but we're going to just have to see. Weapons on board are supposed to be 4 size 3 fixed laser repeaters, so if we compare that to Panthers on the Saber, that would be DPS that comes out at about 1760, which is fairly high, and add to that 8 size 2 missiles, and I think what we have is a really competitive ship in an interesting body and flight model. I have a hard time recommending this flat out because it feels like there's a lot of unknown and stuff that could change over time. But based on some of the assumptions and stats that we can look at and what we can glean from the card to all, I think this is going to be a pretty legit fighter that it would be really tough to go up against. So there you have it. That's our final rundown of ships that we've included in the fighter category, and it is by far the biggest category that we're going to cover in this series. I would say that if you're looking for the best well-rounded ship on the list, the base Saber has the best combination of flight model, damage output, and durability. If you're looking for the best Brawler on the list, my recommendation is still going to be the Super Hornet because you have the ability to gimbal a lot of weapons to deal with faster targets and use gimbal assist. And you do have the hull strength to stick around as long as you need to. And if you're in need of a ship that will empower you to log out when and where you see fit, all while being a very capable fighter with a bit of flair, the Banded Defender is the great option there. So that's it. We're going to be moving into another category coming very soon. If you guys have questions on this, please let me know or get your suggestions into the comments. Otherwise, I appreciate y'all watching. Have yourselves a wonderful day, and take care.